Kill the unbelievers wherever you find them and take them, detain them, and sit and wait for them, ambush them at every place. But if they repent and keep up the prayers, surely Allah is merciful. According to Islam, there are three options for the unbeliever: convert, pay a tax, or die. This is being driven by an evil ideology that is working its way westward, worming its way into the West. This is a kind of persecution you hear nothing about. The kinds of persecution that are taking place in Africa, parts of Asia, and throughout the Middle East are horrifying. Now, I had been in Nigeria before. I was there to try to bring attention, to shine a light on what is taking place there. And northern Nigeria and increasingly central Nigeria is incredibly dangerous and arguably the most dangerous country in the world. The Nigerians couldn't believe that I had risked my life to come and see them and to tell their story. These are people who are ready to die to defend me. How does the persecution work? It's important that you understand that what's happening in Nigeria isn't new. It isn't even especially remarkable. This isn't about some sort of turf or territorial war. That's not what's happening here. This is a genocide. This is a genocide, and it is driven by the fact that Islam states that this is what you're supposed to do if you're a Muslim.
You know, I've spent my career taking on some of the cultural baddies, you know, some of the most prominent intellectuals in the world, some of them in public debate, some of them behind the scenes. And I've come to realize that ideas define everything that we do. With an academic degree, you're trained to be a researcher and writer to the point that it's annoying. I mean, but I'm grateful for it. I'm not talking about books I've not read. I'm not talking about papers I've not read. Whether I agree with them or not actually isn't the point. There are quite a few books that I would read that I would say are actually evil books. Donald Trump, when he was in a divorce with his first wife, she said he has a copy of Mein Kampf next to his bed. I wish more people did. If the German people had bothered to read that book rather than just have it on their shelf, we might have avoided the Holocaust. If more people read the Quran, they'd be wiser to what Islam actually is, what they actually believe. If people bothered to read, as I have, the writings of Klaus Schwab and the various contributors to the World Economic Forum and the ideas that are driving the globalists, I read them because I want to understand their mentality. I cut out the middleman. I go straight to the ideology. Everything in your life is being defined by either your ideas or the ideas of the people around you. And each episode, we're going to be digging into a different idea that appears in the culture. This is Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.
Today we are discussing the genocide of Christians in Nigeria. Now, this is a massively important issue, and you may say, what do I care about Nigeria? Well, you should care just as a human being, but I hope that you'll also learn something in this episode about how this is working and how it actually is having an impact on your own life, because this is being driven by an evil ideology that is working its way westward, worming its way into the West. And you need to be very well informed about how it operates and about how it works. Now, regular viewers of Ideas Have Consequences will know that earlier this year, I was in Cairo. And when I was there was a big standoff outside of USAID that went something like this.
They're stopping my driver. They're telling me they want my phone because I have videoed the USAID facility and so forth. I've told them they can't have the phone. So now they're telling my driver he has to get out. So I'm continuing the video.
All right, I'm being detained by USAID Cairo. I'm outside of the gate. They've taken my driver's license, not mine, his. They've demanded my passport. They have demanded, gotta put this down. They have demanded my phone. Again, we've not entered into the facility. We've taken no pictures of the facility on this particular occasion, but they did know that who I was, that I was the guy who was here last week, and I decided to come back to just take one more look. Had no intention of entering, and we didn't. But this time, they were laying in wait for us. They've blocked the car, and now they've suggested that I'm some sort of terrorist. And they know better than that. They know that I have no such intentions. I'm quite Googleable. And they were very aware of my my viral tweet from last time. But again, that's what's going on here. So, if I go dark, you'll know what happened. Now, that was quite an episode that took place there. Again, that was right outside of USAID in Cairo, their huge compound there. And it happened because we were driving by. I had been inside the compound earlier in the week, and I decided to go back. I had embarrassed them the first time by getting past their security, not because I climbed any walls or rappelled, through ventilation shafts, but simply because I approached the gate and approached the place like I own it, say the way I do at the every year at the World Economic Forum, and they opened the gate. And I came straight in, and then I went through more security that I just walked straight past them. They even opened the door for me, and went right in. And I was asking them questions about their operations. At that time, President Trump had issued an executive order calling for the shutdown of USAID. So Trump had just been inaugurated. And so I walked in and I said, yes, I'd love to interview your director, find out exactly what you guys are doing here, and ask if you are complying with the President of the United States' order, his executive order to cease operations. Now, that went sideways. I left, that's discussed in another episode of Ideas Have Consequences that was probably made somewhere in February, I would guess, and also in an article that we can put in the show notes that explains in detail what happened there, a piece that I wrote for the Federalist. But here's the part that I couldn't tell you at the time. And that is that I wasn't in Cairo chiefly for USAID. I was there for something that unfortunately has to be quite covert, and that is meeting with persecuted Christians in the third world. That was my purpose, my chief purpose. USAID was part of it, but my chief purpose in going there was to meet with persecuted Christians. And the Zabaleen, who are there in Cairo, which again, I still haven't done an episode on the Zabaleen yet, and I want to tell you about them because they are amazing people. In Egyptian Arabic, it means the garbage people. They live literally on the periphery of Egyptian society because they're not allowed to integrate by virtue of the fact that they're Christians. And again, this is a kind of persecution you hear nothing about. Now, we suffer suffer's too strong a word, but we experience, let's say, a kind of soft persecution for being Christians in the West. And that may be a job loss. It may be, being marked off the party list or not getting a promotion or two. The kinds of persecution that are taking place in Africa, parts of Asia, and throughout the Middle East are horrifying. And it goes largely unreported in the West. This should concern you, whether you are Christian or not. If you have any feeling, any sentiment for humanity at all, this should absolutely alarm you. But I was in Cairo to meet with Nigerian Christians as well. And that's because I couldn't get into Nigeria again. Now, I had been in Nigeria before, and I was there to write a piece for Fox News, which also is in the show notes, that's titled The Forgotten Christians of Nigeria. I was there to try to bring attention, to shine a light on what is taking place there. And this kind of gives you a little bit of insight into the way that I view my own work. There's a terrific scene in an otherwise, kind of mediocre movie based on Tom Clancy's novel, Clear and Present Danger, where you have American special forces who have gone to war against the drug cartels in Colombia. It looks like we might be doing that again sometime soon. And here they are, just a small band. They're not, they're not equipped to face an army. They're a small force that is hunting down where the cartels are operating. And you have this great scene where they have located, one of the head honchos for the cartel, and they shine a laser. They point a laser on his hacienda, and then miles off the coast, hundreds of miles off the coast, the United States Navy launches a cruise missile that is directed by that laser. And they hold the laser right on the spot, and then boom, the cruise missile hits it. In a way, that's the kind of work that I'm doing. I have been given a platform, not an enormous platform. I don't have, Tucker Carlson's platform. I don't have the platform of Megyn Kelly, but I'm able to bring attention to some of these kinds of things and thus shine a laser on it, so that in hoping that people with the larger platforms who aren't doing what I'm doing, they're not going out and risking themselves in these kinds of places. They're simply reporting, or they're commenting on news because that's what they do full time, whereas it isn't what I do full time, and getting the word out. And in this case, Fox News was willing to publish what I had to say and what was going on there, and American Spectator and some other places, and then doing interviews and these kinds of things, again, to bring attention to this. In certain times, wise investors look for stability. Markets are overinflated, inflation remains a concern, and global tensions continue to rise. That's why many are turning to the safety of physical gold and silver. Alpha Omega Gold is a Christian-owned precious metals company known for honesty, transparency, and biblical stewardship principles. Their team help clients protect their investment with integrity and clear guidance, never pressure. Right now, Alpha Omega Gold is offering a free precious metals navigation guide to explain why owning gold and silver can be a smart, strategic hedge for retirement accounts and long-term security. Don't wait until economic shifts impact your future. So today, go and visit www.ao.gold/IHC or call 855-4AO-GOLD. That's 855-426-4653. Call today to learn how simple it can be to secure what matters most. So I was trying to shine a laser on this issue in Nigeria. I'd been invited there by an Anglican bishop who had become a friend of mine in the United States. And knowing that I was a writer, he asked me if I would come. Would you come? Would you tell the story of our people? And I don't think he thought I was going to accept his invitation, because he'd invited others who had all turned him down because they deemed it to be too risky to go to Nigeria. But I told him, that I would go, because I felt that that was something the Lord wanted me to do. And I wanted to see how my fellow Christians, my brothers and sisters in Christ, are suffering. I feel a real passion for, a deep concern for persecuted believers around the world, and that we should, to the extent that we're able, share in those sufferings, that we understand those sufferings, that we are able to tell people, in the first world who are not suffering, what's taking place, to bring attention to it, to bring aid to them. So the plan was pretty simple. I would fly into Abuja, which is in, kind of south central Nigeria. I would fly in there, and I would be picked up very quickly, because most of the planes flying in have very few white people on them. And if there are white people in these planes, they are inevitably, work, either government officials working at embassies, or they are working for the oil companies. And so as soon as you arrive, they are immediately picked up by armed security in armored cars and driven away. And in my case, I have a whole philosophy about the ineffectiveness of the kind of armed security that I would be able to afford, which would not include an armored vehicle. And, you're talking maybe a couple of bodyguards, with guns. Generally, that's pretty ineffective. All it does is announce you as someone who might be significant, who might be worth kidnapping or worth killing. And you also have to ask yourself, are these guys who are really willing to risk their lives, maybe even give their lives for me? And the answer is almost always no. They aren't really anticipating they are going to have to use force. They're hoping that their mere presence will intimidate other people. So I choose to forego security well, I'm trying to think of an instance where I had armed security. I was speaking at Ole Miss once on Islam, interestingly enough. They did provide me with security because there was some fear that somebody might try to rush the stage. But I think that's the only time. In the third world, I've never had it. And you just hope that you're in and out quickly enough before the baddies even really know you're there. What is the country song? When you're going through hell, keep on going, and perhaps you'll get out before the devil even knows you're there. Well, it's that way in some parts of the third world, and that's what I did. And I was put into a car, hidden in a car, and then driven 6 hours north on roads where the Fulani herdsman militia, which is an Islamic terrorist group, and bandits are known to operate. And the way they typically operate is they throw down nail strips, in front of your vehicle. You slam on the brakes if you don't run over it, and you put it in reverse. And then they've thrown down, another group behind you has thrown down more nail strips. And the next thing you know, they're making Swiss cheese out of your automobile. This is very, very common, this kind of thing. But again, it largely goes unreported. A busload of black Africans are blown up by some Islamic group, and it barely makes a headline in the West. This is the reality of the suffering of persecution of Christians in the third world. It's what it looks like. So I was driven to the north, and I saw and heard, I sat and listened to many Christians who were telling their stories and giving me, really a picture of what is going on in those places. And listen, architecture is often, pay attention, this is just a little interesting thing you can do when you travel. Architecture is often a clue about a society. It often offers you real insight. I've always thought it was very interesting that in, let's say, modern day France, which we think of as a very civilized country, that in old houses, very old maisons or chateaux, you will find, heavy wood and steel doors that have loads of locks, and then bars, literal bars that go over the doors. Sometimes they're anchored into a concrete floor and then braced against the door. Now, why would that be? Why would that be? Well, it speaks of a prior horror. It speaks of a previous time in their history, or times in their history, where people were very afraid in their homes, where they were being besieged. Now, is that during the Nazi era? Possibly. That certainly happened on many occasions, but we're talking about homes that are much older, and where the bars themselves are much older. So we might even be going back to, let's say, the 30 Years' War or something like that. The point is that architecture tells you a lot. And when you arrive in a country, and if you see a home surrounded by walls with palisades all across the top of those walls, that's a clue to you that the people inside are afraid. They are protecting themselves in a way that, generally speaking, unless you live in inner city New York or Miami or Chicago or LA, you probably aren't doing. As a black friend of mine who grew up in a rough part of Chicago, said to me many years ago that he found that driving through white neighborhoods in the South so fascinating to him. And I said, why is that? And he said, because I see these these giant bay windows in the front where you can look through and see people inside sitting and having dinner. There are no bars on the windows. The doors look like you could just kick them in very, very easily. He says, that's not what it's like where I grew up. So again, the architecture tells you something. In Nigeria, in many parts, most parts of Africa, particularly West Africa, which is East Africa, is fairly tame in most parts. Not all of it, certainly not the Sudan, Somalia, but the kinds of things that are happening throughout West Africa, which I will describe in this episode of Ideas Have Consequences. Homes have rebar in the windows, and the doors are fortified. For people who can afford them, they are reinforced steel with multiple locks. When we finally arrived at our destination in the north central part of the country, where the Fulani herdsmen and the Boko Haram, again, both Islamic terrorist groups, are known to operate, I was taken to a home. I was put inside this home, and this is common. This is often the way this works. But again, to Americans, to Westerners who've never been in these kinds of circumstances, these kinds of places where you can get killed very, very quickly, I was placed into a home where all the windows had bars on them, so that if there was a fire, there was no way for me to get out. I mean, I'd just be roasted on the inside of that house. You may say, well, certainly you could go out the front door or the back door. I could not. There was no back door, first of all. Second of all, the front door was locked from the outside. So my Christian hosts locked it for my protection. They locked it from the outside. And the very next day when they came for me, again, this is just kind of a glimpse to you as to what life is like there. The next day when they came for me, it took them a moment to find me in the house because I didn't hear them coming. And when I finally greeted my host, who looked upset, I said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "Well, it took you so long to come to the door that I feared something had happened to you during the night." Meaning he was afeared. He was afraid. Afeared is a good word. He was afraid that I had been murdered, macheted, or killed with an AK-47, or perhaps kidnapped during the night. You wouldn't immediately jump to that conclusion in the United States if you knock on a door at your friend's house and it takes him a minute to come to the door. But you see, that's what life is like in this part of Nigeria. Southern Nigeria is not as dangerous. I'm not going to say it's not dangerous. I'm just going to say it's not as dangerous. Northern Nigeria, and increasingly central Nigeria, is incredibly dangerous and arguably the most dangerous country in the world. Now, often you will see on, these lists, sometimes silly lists that I see people compile that say this is, the most, the top 10 most dangerous countries in the world. Sometimes Nigeria is on it, sometimes it isn't. But I think the reason for it not being on there is because people just get tired of saying it. It's like saying that the number one bestseller every week of every year for decades is the Bible. Gets boring. So it just simply isn't even listed anymore. And Nigeria is a bit like that. And so that you will have some sense of the way of just how dangerous it is, other Africans look at Nigeria as a terrifying country. So that when I'm in a taxi cab, let's say in Cairo or in Johannesburg or, in some other part of Africa, let's say Morocco, and I say that I've come there or I'm going to Nigeria, you can almost see them visibly shudder. They will say, I would never go to Nigeria. Nigeria is like Venezuela, what Venezuela is to South America, insofar as it is the most prosperous country, not the rank and file people, not at all. It's extremely third world, but it's the wealthiest due to oil. So maybe 1% of the population actually controls it. And it's very infamous for the sheer scale of the horror, of the terror that takes place in that country. And it's also well known for its occult, the practicing of satanic cults takes place there an awful lot. So that as an honor to me, and this is something I haven't talked about very much, that I had come, the Nigerians couldn't believe, that I had risked my life to come and see them and to tell their story. And they, for me, by the way, these are people who were ready to die to defend me. They're absolutely remarkable Christians. I just don't feel worthy of them. I feel like we as Westerners are just pansies, compared to these people because of what they're used to suffering. But it is a great honor to me. The day that I was speaking at the cathedral, I was invited by the bishop to speak there. They just wanted to, what's the word that's gone straight out of my head? They wanted to make me a priest. And so did. I went through the entire process of becoming an Anglican priest. So I am, I don't wear the collar, but I am an ordained. That's the word I was looking for. I went through the entire process, which is very formal, of being ordained as an Anglican priest. And prior to the ceremony, I was sitting in the office of the bishop, and I'm reading through the vows that I am to take. And it speaks of not belonging to satanic practices that involve the drinking of blood and these kind of things. I found it quite jarring. And I said, what in the world? The kinds of creeds and things that we read in the West just don't speak of this. And yet here this was. And he was explaining to me, very common here. Very, very common. People in very high society who secretly belong to cults that involve human sacrifices. Now, some of you are listening to this and going, oh, this can't possibly be true. It is true. It is true. This is the kind of stuff that takes place there. So this is actually embedded, encoded into their, into the vows that I was to take. But again, the architecture indicating to you, it's a clue to you that even if it's a beautiful day and everything seems fine and kids are outside, playing and families seem to be fine, you look at the architecture and you go, ooh, something bad occasionally happens here because people are protecting themselves. Ordinary people, most of them can't afford to do much, but those who can afford it put walls around their home with broken glass in the mortar at the very top so that you would cut your hands, trying to climb over it. It doesn't stop the Fulani or the Boko Haram, but it certainly does slow them down. And often the people who will have these walls, their windows will be barred, their doors will be steel reinforced, and the gate to get in and out, through the wall is also reinforced steel. And it's usually a boy who sits there. And he opens and closes the gate. When you arrive, he peeks through. We honk the horn. He peeks through, opens the gate, and closes it behind us. He's not a security guard. It's just his job to open and close the gate and to call out if there is an attack. Usually, someone there, 24 hours a day. That this is what they do. Now, how does the persecution work? This is another piece of this puzzle that Westerners don't understand. They do not understand it. And quite honestly, it's amazing to me that this goes on at the scale. It's taking place at a continental scale. And yet, almost nothing is known about this. Almost nothing is known about this. Or perhaps I should repeat it, rephrase it. Almost nothing is reported about it. I like the way one author put it in an article published in Spectator magazine. He called it the largest unreported catastrophe of our time, citing that Christians are the most persecuted people on the planet. But do you know that? When you hear the global left speak, when you hear Democrats speak, do you hear that? Have you heard BLM say anything about that? Antifa, have you heard them talking about this? No. You do not. And the only reason right now, it's important that you understand that what's happening in Nigeria isn't new. It isn't even especially remarkable. speaking just last week to my bishop friend to get a report from him of what is going on there, he was saying it's the same as always. It's just that right now it's gotten a little bit of attention because it, for some reason, has appeared in Western media, and now President Trump is talking about it. The last time it got a little bit of attention, Trump was president. You see, Democrats and Republicans, and it's worth saying this, that Nigerian Christians love Trump. They adore him. You always hear that President Trump is hated around the world. As a guy who travels as much as I do, who is abroad as much as I do, it's the same outside the United States as in it, which is to say the elitists, the champagne glass clinking types, elitist types you find along the Champs-Elysees, yeah, they hate Trump. Taxi drivers don't. They don't in London, they don't in Rome, they don't in Paris, and they don't in Africa. The ordinary people around the world love Trump. And Nigerian Christians love Trump. And why is it that they love him? Because, and they will tell you this, he is the first president in memory to call Islam what it is. Prior presidents, be they Democrat or Republican, have referred to Islam as a religion of peace. As the religion of peace. And it's a very, understandably, deeply upsetting for them. I cannot tell you the number of Christians in Africa, one of the first things that come out of their mouth when they meet me and say, why do your politicians, why do your presidents call Islam a religion of peace? Why do they do that? We're being slaughtered by these people, murdered by these people. And your politicians will go on CNN and BBC and call it a religion of peace. Why do they do that? Except for Trump. Trump has been the one guy who hasn't done that, and they love him for it. They love him for the fact that he's willing to do something on their behalf to defend them, because he's calling a spade, and we will come back to that. But how does the persecution itself work? I would love the opportunity, Mr. President, to explain all of this to you on some occasion, because it's so important that this part be understood, because it's happening in the West. It's just happening in a slightly different way than what I'll explain here. But here's how the strategy goes. This is what it looks like. According to Islamic law, a Muslim man can have up to 4 wives, and in Africa they usually do. And he can have innumerable concubines, mistresses. And what that means is an African Muslim male might have, no kidding, there's no exaggeration here, he might have 50, 75, 100, or even more than 100 children. This is very common, and you're going to start seeing it taking place, in the West. It already is in parts of Europe, but you're going to start seeing a lot more of this in Mondani's, New York. This is going to happen in Saqib Khan's London. Islam encourages this. And so some Muslim cleric comes to this man's, the man who's fathered all these children. They come to his door. He's third world. He doesn't have 2 wooden nickels to rub together. And they tell him, look, we will feed your children and we'll educate them, but we have to take them away to school. And he'll usually agree. He's not doing anything for most of them anyway. And they are put on trucks and they are taken to neighboring Christian majority villages or cities, or in this case, a country like Nigeria, where they are dropped off at intersections in the middle of town. They are dropped off at gas stations. They're dropped off at markets and pushed out into the streets. And an imam will appear, usually funded by Saudi Arabia. Bear in mind that Boko Haram and the Fulani herdsmen militia, again, both Islamic terrorist groups, but they're Sunni. The Boko Haram is Sunni. The Fulani, the majority of them are Sunni Muslims. Saudi Arabia is Sunni. Saudi Arabia sends these imams into these parts of the West. They're also funding the building of mosques all over the world, and the West in particular, targeting the United States for the building of these mosques. This is all about conquest, and they've got the money to do it. And they send these imams into these places with the intention of radicalizing people, so that you will hear many Africans tell stories that go like this, that when they were a kid, they grew up in a town where there were the Christians and there were the Muslims, but they got along pretty well with one another. This bishop would tell me stories of his best friends were Muslims, spend the night at their house and they at his house. But then the clerics begin to show up. And when they do, the Muslims begin behaving more like Muslims. You see, most Muslims don't read the Quran and don't want to read the Quran. They don't want to read the Hadith. They do not want to have to model their lives after Muhammad because they know it's violent. Some years ago, I was invited to hear a Muslim who was living under a fatwa, that is to say, a death sentence, kind of like Salman Rushdie. And it was at a secret location. Only just a small group of people were invited to hear him speak. And he was the child of a high-ranking Syrian official. And he had converted to Christianity. And so his father, according to Islamic law, was supposed to kill him, supposed to murder him. His father tried, but he managed to escape. He managed to get out of the country, move to Europe, and then eventually to the United States, where he lives in hiding, permanent hiding, because he's a Christian. But he said something that I found fascinating. It's what I just told you, that most Muslims, they do not want to read the Quran. They do not want to read the Hadith because they know it's violent and it makes them feel like bad Muslims. It makes them feel guilty. So when these Muslim clerics begin showing up in these villages and these cities in Africa, shaking their little stick, and they tell these people, you are bad Muslims. You are not behaving like Muslims. What begins to happen is those Muslims that you knew and with whom you got along with, they suddenly begin withdrawing from you. You can feel a disturbance in the force. Something's happening. They're withdrawing from you. Now women are beginning to wear the hijab and the burqa that they didn't wear before. They dressed exactly the same as you. And then not too long after that, the violence begins to occur because they're slowly radicalizing the Muslim communities. And that's what they do here. They send these Muslim Islamic clerics into these towns where these children have all been dropped off. And the Nigerians, because see, this started happening first in Nigeria around 2000, around the year 2000. Nigerians themselves, Nigerian Christians, were saying, what in the world? What is going on? They would say we saw them. We didn't think too much about it because they weren't bothering us really. I mean, they were kind of annoying, trying to sell you stuff and gather around you on the street. But there was no violence. We just wondered where these children were coming from. Because you see, they didn't know because it wasn't being reported even in Africa. It was happening all over West Africa. All over West Africa. So these children begin appearing and they're thinking, what is this all about? Well, then the Muslim clerics, the imams come, and their job is to give these children trinkets to sell, which they do. The idea is to make them resourceful and to make money, to give them trinkets to sell, to give them just a little bit of food, but not enough to really satisfy them, again, to make them resourceful, to make them thieves. So a problem to society, and then to give them Islamic instruction, which is just simply to say, to radicalize them. And then maybe after a few years, these kids have been roaming the streets of whatever town or village you care to name in north or central Nigeria. They'll decide, the terrorist groups will decide, okay, it's time to attack the Christians. We're ready now to do it. And by now, the kids know the villages, the cities, the towns really well. They can serve as guides. So they come to these children, they arm them, usually with machetes, because machetes are so cheap to reproduce and also with some AK-47s. They give them just a little bit of training, and then they say, show us where the vicar lives. Take us to his house. They get the kids to take them to identify those people who are targeted to be murdered. Now, I've seen these children all over Nigeria. And, people who served in places like Vietnam and Korea will know that what I'm about to say is true. And that is that a Western mentality, particularly an American mentality, especially a Southern United States mentality, we are taught to show great deference to women. We still open doors here. We still pull back chairs. We still say yes, sir, and no, sir, and yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. We are taught to show great deference to women and to children, which is, in my opinion, appropriate. Call me old school, but I live by that code. But I will tell you that code will get you killed in parts of the third world. In Central America, when I'm following some of these migrant caravans, you might think, because I do realize some people think that women in these circumstances, say with a drug cartel or, working in a brothel, or some of these Muslim women in the Middle East and Africa, your sensibility is such as you think these people are living under oppression. I have to save them. And one of the great shocking realities for me early in my career was the realization that not every woman in these kinds of circumstances is actually a damsel in distress. To view them as such might get you killed. And it's because some of them are the most strict enforcers of whatever the code may be. It might be the cartel's code. It might be, a code of communism, of Marxism, or it might be that of Islam. But you have to be very careful. And the children also, because the children are weaponized. And so you're on a street, let's say in Colombia, trying to track down an individual or something that's happening there, some evil that you're trying to expose, and you see children on the street playing soccer, and you think, oh, how sweet. I'll just take a picture. And you don't know that one of those little boys has been given a cell phone and that he's working for the cartel, because the cartel, maybe somebody there gives him a little bit of candy, maybe a little bit of money. Maybe it's a promise to protect his mom or his family. And he's given instructions, if you ever see anything unusual, you see the police, you see white people who are almost always Westerners who are, either with the government in some form of capacity or they're investigative journalists. If you see them, call us. You have to be careful. You have to be careful. And that's why I say the Western mentality is often a mentality that has no place in these circumstances. Sadly, because you think all these people see themselves as victims, and some of them do, and some of them will readily accept your help. Some of them will kill you. And it's that way, maybe especially that way, when you're dealing with an ideology like Islam. So I've seen these children all over the place, and you'll pull into a gas station, which is sort of a ramshackle kind of place, and the kids press against the car, dozens of them, their faces against the car, peering in, possibly reporting on what they're seeing. There's a white man in this car. What is he doing in northern Nigeria? And by the way, this isn't a racial comment. My Nigerian friends will tell you white people are in grave danger. My Colombian friends say to me when I'm going to some of these places, a translator. I remember a young woman who's a dear family friend, her saying to me, and she said it just like this. She said, me going to this cartel town, I'm probably safe. I'm Colombian. They can see that. And they know I'm poor. You? And then she circled a face like this. Gringo. And then add to that I'm tall. I'm 6'3". I've got this shock of gray hair, and I'm quintessentially American, meaning I'm not easy to hide. I'm not easy to hide. And so your strategy has to be that you're either hidden all the time or you are just as bold and as confident as you can be, because sometimes that intimidates people and causes them to back down. So you pull into a gas station, dozens of kids press around the car. And then usually trying to sell you things, but you can see the look of shock on their face when they see that you're a white man and that you're in northern Nigeria. You start getting attention. This is the way this works. But you see, the children become the end of the spear. And they attack. And they kill loads of Christians. And they're used both by the Fulani herdsmen. Well, they're used by everybody, around the world. Children always have been, and young people who fill the ranks of BLM and Antifa. They're the end of that spear. They're just cannon fodder. They don't care what happens to those people. They just pretend they do. And such is the case here. Such is the case here. And so what happens when they attack the homes of these Christians? Well, usually the men, the males, are killed. Most often with machetes, sometimes with AK-47s, but usually with machetes. Old women are killed too. The young women and even little children, little girls, are taken off into sex slavery. And listen, the slave trade is alive and well. You hear about the transatlantic slave trade. The much bigger slave trade is the African slave trade, Africans enslaving other Africans, and the Muslim slave trade, which has gone on since the time of Muhammad, if he ever lived. There's questions about that. See my friend Jay Smith, I've had him on this show and I've hosted in my home many times, and the two of us have debated, radical Muslims in London on a number of occasions. Just see what Jay has to say about this. He's done a lot of research on whether Muhammad existed or not. But aside from that, throughout the history of Islam, this is the way it has worked. And some people would say, yeah, but they do that in everything. No. This is part of Islam. This is what Islam is. And these girls are sold in slave markets, and they are used up until no one wants them, and they are discarded. They're murdered. Now, a Christian that I'll call Ezra, a Nigerian Christian that I'll call Ezra, who worked for a British company for many years, and who's wealthy by Nigerian standards, not by Western standards, but by Nigerian standards. He had told me that the Christians in his diocese, within his own church, were being murdered, were being slaughtered. And so what he did was he took his own money, his own resources, and he purchased weapons and armed them so that the next time they were attacked, either by Boko Haram or the Fulani, that they would be ready. And they were. So that when they did attack, and I think this is in 2012, they bloodied them. They defended themselves and they bloodied them. Guess what happened? The United Nations then intervened, called it a human rights violation, and then disarmed the Christians. Someone has asked me, how did they disarm them? It's a good question. It's a fair question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if they came house to house. I don't know what they did, but they did do it. And Ezra told me that they did it. And the government, of course, permitted this because the government itself is controlled by Muslims. And the government gives a storefront that they're concerned, and they're doing what they can. They're investigating. We have our best people on this, that they're investigating this and that they're going to stop it, when the reality is they're facilitating it. The police themselves will inform the terrorist groups where the Christians are having a meeting, a gathering, a conference, who the leaders are, so that they might be attacked, so that they might be killed. This is what's going on. And the government turns a blind eye to this and goes, wow, this is so terrible. What is happening here? But you see, The goal is conquest. The goal is conquest. Now, I reported about this in a piece for Fox News, as I mentioned earlier. Again, that will be in the show notes if you would like to read this. Now, I tried to return to Nigeria last autumn. And the Nigerian government effectively, they delayed in issuing a visa and effectively, blocked my reentry. And I was going again to Nigeria because, listen, members of my board, and I have friends, certainly family, understandably, who will say, Larry, you don't have to go there. You can do a Zoom call. But you see, I feel that it's important to put boots on the ground where you can, and that you risk something for them, because they're risking everything. And when they know that other Christians are willing to suffer with them, I cannot tell you how much it encourages them. I mentioned earlier that I spoke in their cathedral there. I'm not sure anything I said really resonated with them. I don't know. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. What I do know is that my mere presence of being there meant everything to them. It meant everything to them that I was willing to walk to the cathedral while groups of Muslims were standing around and bumping up against me, that I'm willing to push through that and go and preach while Muslims surround the church. They're sitting on the church walls, watching, staring through the windows. There were no attacks, but you couldn't know that for sure. And the church had been firebombed before by the Boko Haram. And this had been previously a Christian village. It was all Christians who lived there. Now the cathedral itself sits like an island in a sea of Muslims who are themselves radicalized. It means everything to them. So I wanted to go and encourage them. I wanted to go and meet with them and, report once again, trying again to shine a laser on what was happening there, so that people with the bigger platforms or bigger organizations that can bring help, that can bring aid, that can bring protection, or that the President of the United States himself might hear about it, as he did from my reporting about USAID in South America when I was on doing an interview on Steve Bannon's show. And I was talking about this very thing, and the president texted Bannon saying that he was watching the interview and to tell me that this was very important information that he was going to act on. That's what you're hoping to happen. But you see, I couldn't get in. And it was discouraging to them because they were looking forward to me coming. And I said, look, we'll meet elsewhere. How about we meet? I'll instead of me spending the money to go there, we'll bring you here. And the response was, don't have visas to get into the United States. Again, Biden was still president last year at this time. What if I meet you somewhere in Europe? Don't have visas to get into Europe. Isn't it crazy that people are crossing the Mediterranean in boats, Muslims invading Europe, and almost nobody is saying or doing anything about it except for Giorgia Meloni, and she's being overwhelmed. But actual Christians who are actually being persecuted and who actually need asylum, when they applied for it in places like Britain and France, in Germany, they were denied it. I said, it's okay. I'll meet you in Africa. I'll meet you in Cairo. I'm already going to Cairo to meet with the Zabaleen, other persecuted Christians. I'll meet you there. We will fly you there. We will pay for it. We will have you come there, and there we can meet, there we can talk, and there you can get some rest away from this. But we have to be careful, and that's because Egypt, while it isn't an Islamic state, it is a Muslim majority country where Islam is the state religion. And they're not too keen on Christians, particularly Black African Christians. American Christians don't trouble them too much, and that's because they consider American Christians to be milquetoast, kind of a big bunch of nothing. And also because they want American money. Egypt's number one industry is tourism, and for good reason. They're extraordinary treasures to be seen in Egypt. Sadly, I'll never be able to go and see them again because of what happened, on this particular trip at USAID. But I'd already been there several times, and I guess I had my opportunity. But we had to be careful because while they're not particularly troubled that I would be a Christian, they might be if they knew that I was coming to proselytize. That would be different. Someone posted in the comments, I don't remember if it's on YouTube or if it was on Twitter or something, but someone had said that they were flying into Cairo and they had Christian tracts, and those were discovered in a backpack or something, and they immediately, shipped him out of the country. They will do that. That is for sure. But in my case, I know better than to do that. I'm not bringing anything like that. So I arrive in the country, but I realize that their situation is more precarious because, as I said, they're Christians, and more than that, they're Black African Christians. Now, why does that matter? Well, again, another aspect of Islam that seldom is reported is that Islam is, by definition, racist. Their own literature refers to Black people as essentially as subhuman, as a sub-race. Muslims often laugh behind their hands at the notion that Black people are converting to Islam because they think you people, you're like, that little, GIF or GIF or whatever they're called that shows the chickens walking to Kentucky Fried Chicken. Like, don't even know where they're going. They don't even know they're going to the slaughter. Arab Muslims look down, generally speaking, it's not true of every Arab, but Arabs and Arab Muslims in particular generally look down on Black people as less than them and mistreat them. Now, if I was in his company with these African Christians, they would not do that. But if I'm away, they will, or they might be more inclined to do so. So we had to sort of keep it on the down low, as it were, that these were not just Black Africans, but that they were Black African Christians trying to fly into Nigeria. And I had to write a letter of introduction for them to even get into the country and state why I wanted to meet with them. Now, I never stated that it's because they're persecuted Christians. The Egyptian government's all for that. They'd have no problem with that. I've already mentioned to you the Zabaleen. So instead, I had to speak in terms of not dishonestly, but leading somewhat away from the real reason. I had to speak in terms of meeting as friends and that we're meeting to discuss upcoming events and things like this. And they were granted visas, had great difficulty acquiring them, but were granted visas to come to Cairo and to meet with me. And that's why I was there. To encourage, to hear. One of the things that I thought was so wonderful was, a very good hotel in the third world is very cheap. So we stayed in a very luxurious hotel. And I told him, after I leave, you can stay here. Stay here for several more days. I want you to enjoy this place. I want you to enjoy the sleep. I want you to enjoy the service. I want you to enjoy the pool. Do not leave the hotel. Stay in the hotel, but enjoy everything inside it, the restaurants and so forth, and charge it to your room, and I will pay for that. I'll see that is done. And I knew that it meant everything because I knew his circumstances. I knew his home. I knew that there had been recent attempts to murder him in his home where people shoved AK-47s through the windows. Again, had the bars, couldn't get into the house, but could break the glass and start shooting inside the house. He ran from one end of the house to the other. They came around over there, knocked out the windows, started shooting inside there too. Couldn't get in. Tried beating down the door, but he called on his phone for help, and they panicked and they ran off. This is a common occurrence for Christians in Africa. It's a very common occurrence. This is what this looks like. So we were able to have a good meeting there and to talk about these things. And then what happened at USAID, which I just decided, hey, while you guys are here, I have something else I have to do. I'm going to pop over to USAID and see if I can get an interview over there. And then everything went sideways with the Egyptian State's police, which is their secret police who are trained by the KGB, by the now the FSB, the same thing. And that became a 3-hour standoff in the road, right in public, where they're trying to get me out of a car, and I'm refusing to get out of it. And it was a fascinating and unnerving 2.5, 3 hours, in that automobile. Again, we'll put that in the show notes, a piece I wrote for the Federalist. We'll also put a link to the episode of Ideas Have Consequences where I talk about this. What is important that you understand about the persecution of Christians in Nigeria is that this isn't about, as it's often reported, some sort of turf or territorial war. Territory has everything to do with Islam. I mean, they're seeking conquest of the entire planet, but it's driven by an ideology. It isn't even a religious war as such. A war implies that there are two armed groups who are going at it. The United States and Germany, United States and Japan, Russia and Germany. That's not what's happening here. This is a genocide. This is a genocide, and it is driven by the fact that Islam states that this is what you're supposed to do if you're a Muslim. Surah, which is to say verse 9:5 in the Quran, says this: kill the unbelievers wherever you find them and take them. In other words, kidnap them, detain them, and sit in wait for them, ambush them at every place. But if they repent and keep up the prayers, surely Allah is merciful. According to Islam, there are 3 options for the unbeliever: convert, pay a tax, or die. In Africa, paying the tax is generally not given to you as an option because most people can't pay it. So it's convert or die. It's convert or die. You will see stats that will say that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. Well, yes, because they convert entire villages, entire families at sword point. You will convert or you will die. You will swear allegiance to Allah or we will cut you down right here, often torturing people to death. All of it deemed to be perfectly in keeping with their ideology, that this is okay. Indeed, you'll be rewarded for it in the hereafter by Allah, who is so merciful. It's demonic. That's what this is. It's demonic. And see, this was happening in the north of Nigeria beginning about 25 years ago, and it's steadily creeping southward. Now, the south of Nigeria, as I say, places like in the city of Nigeria and Lagos and some other places, it's safer, but still dangerous, but not, crazy kind of dangerous like I'm talking about in the north central, part of the country. But now these tactics are creeping southward. Islam encourages and rewards this. So this is just one verse, one surah. Women are the spoils of Islamic war. And it has been this way ever since its founding. They are sexually assaulted. They are bought, sold, and murdered. There are some images, some photographs that I would show you here. We're going to put some images up for you anyway, but I think YouTube will just flag this and suppress it even more than they're going to suppress it anyway. So I won't put the images of the mutilated bodies, on the screen here. But if you just do a search on online, I'm sure you can see some of this that is there, that is very real. The goal of this is to kill Christians and Jews. Not a lot of Jews in Africa, but there are in the places that we've yet to discuss here. The goal is to kill Christians and Jews and drive them out. And violence, so that you'll understand, isn't just peripheral, something incidental, something that maybe they wish, gosh, we just wish that these things didn't happen. It is central to the ideology of Islam. You have to understand that. It is central to the ideology, and to the strategy. And it's working. It's the same in Saqib Khan's London and everywhere else that you find Islam advancing. The number of non-Muslim British living in London has plummeted in recent decades because of this. The violence is there. Do you think Saqib Khan is really troubled by knifings? Do you think he's really troubled by these sex gangs that are trafficking, according to the Times of London, on an industrial scale in girls, white girls, all over? I've discussed Rotherham on here several times, but it's not just Rotherham. The number now is roughly 250,000, and I'm going to guess the number is actually quite a lot higher in Britain alone. Say nothing of, we're not even talking about Africa. We're not even talking about the rest of Europe or Asia or the Middle East. 250,000. And almost nobody's been prosecuted. Do you think Saqib Khan, to say nothing of Keir Starmer, but Starmer's not a Muslim. Starmer's just a scumbag. Starmer is bought and paid for. He's soulless. Saqib Khan isn't troubled by the knifings. He's not troubled by the murders. He's not troubled by the terrorist attacks. He's not troubled by the beheadings. And that is because it's part of the strategy. His job is to pretend, like the Nigerian government, that he's deeply concerned. If he gives any acknowledgement at all, which usually he does not. In a recent attack, he said nothing. That's what's happening. The goal is to drive them out. And it's not just in Africa, it's happening in London. I saw a stat yesterday that in London, it is estimated that now that Mandani is the mayor of New York, that according to a poll, more than 1 million New Yorkers will flee that city. Again, I suggest to you the number ultimately will be far more than that. Maybe the initial exodus will be 1 million, but I think it'll be far more worse than that. New York is going to become third world very quickly. It will become a foothold for jihadists, just as London has become that. You're going to see street preachers in New York, just like you see the ones in London. And I'm not talking about Christian street preachers. I'm talking about the ones who are preaching hate, who are preaching jihad. That's what you're going to start seeing there. And people are leaving because that's the goal. The violence, the threat of violence causes them to leave. And that therefore cede territory that becomes territory for Allah. So what's happening in Africa isn't actually wholly unique, because it's happening all over the West, just in a slightly different form, but the strategy itself remains the same. Now, the Western mind can't conceive of this. And so often when I find myself talking to Western groups, I can see looks of skepticism, their faces registering some skepticism at what I'm saying. Others believing it quite rightly, expressing, horror. But some people thinking, surely this is an exaggeration. Surely this isn't happening. The reason for that skepticism is this. The Western mind is either heavily influenced by Judeo-Christian worldview, where people have, whether you're a Christian or you're Jewish or not, where you have inhaled very deeply of a Western ethos, which has its basis in the Christian faith. And their moral sensibilities, their moral outlook is informed by this. And the result is we tend to give the other guy the benefit of the doubt. We don't, as a rule, particularly in the part of the country where I live, in the so-called Bible Belt. Lawrence Fox, my dear friend, the British actor and activist with whom I do the show WTF, also on this channel, he marvels at it every time that he comes, and that's because he comes to and he loves it. He says, I just really bask in it because people are very friendly. They're very outgoing. They will help you in this part of the country. And he says, you got nothing like that, in Britain. You experience nothing like that in Britain. Again, that's because of the deep influence of Christianity, not because everybody is a Christian, but because that has been the prevailing ethos, the moral outlook. So the consequence of that is that, for example, my son, when he went to Yale Law, the very first day that they got to New Haven, Connecticut, he put his bicycle out on the porch, on a second floor apartment, and it was instantaneously gone. And it was a jarring realization for him that he was no longer, Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore, because he had it on his porch at his apartments in Birmingham, Alabama for, since he'd owned it. But he got there and boom, it was gone. Somebody actually climbed up and had seen it, saw it, stole it. Boom, gone. Different ethos, different outlook. And Southerners can be very naive, but Americans can be that way overseas, often assuming things that aren't true. It's kind of like what I was telling you about women and children earlier in the program. So that's one reason why the faces of people might register skepticism, because they're thinking, surely Muslims just want to get along like the rest of us and they just want to live and let live. Wrong. You do not understand how an evil ideology, or as we say, ideologies, work if you believe that. Once possessed of it, and we are talking about a kind of possession, people do things that to the Western mind don't make sense. Why would someone want to shoot up Charlie Hebdo over cartoons? Why would they want to fly planes into buildings? Because the ideology to which they have sworn allegiance tells them to do it. That's why. And the Western mind has difficulty conceiving of it. The second reason I think that Westerners have a hard time understanding this is because rather than being influenced by the Christian faith, they're deeply influenced by the absence of any faith whatsoever. They are very secular in outlook. They're very secular in outlook, and thus they have no theology of evil. They don't understand evil, even though certainly evil definitely exists within the secular world in great numbers, but they don't have a theology of evil. And they don't believe there are very many things that are worth dying for, almost nothing, because this life is all you get, you see. So they have difficulty in understanding this too. I'm hoping that I will make a dent in your understanding of this issue, that I will make a dent in convincing you that this is what's happening. And it is to your detriment to ignore it, because it's coming to a city near you. If you live in New York or Dearborn, Michigan, it's already there. If you live in Minneapolis, it's already there. If you live in London, it's there. If you live in Paris, it's there. But you see, Westerners are not putting up their defenses to this because they don't understand it. It's not being reported, and there are very few people who do understand it there to explain it to them. In letting Islam into the West, it's letting orcs into the Shire. And by the way, those people who want to say, that's so racist. Islam is a religion. It is not a race. It is a religion. And no, I'm not saying every Muslim is a terrorist or even a would-be terrorist. What I am telling you is that Islam, when it's taken seriously, the people we call radicals are not radicals. They are Orthodox Muslims. They're the people who are taking their religion seriously. You must understand this. And hence, this is what's taking place in Nigeria. And the scale of it is incredible. The amount of violence is incredible. The human trafficking is incredible. It is estimated, and I think credibly, that the slave trade is bigger today than it was at the time of the transatlantic slave trade. That is bigger now than it's ever been in human history. You just don't see it in the West. You just don't hear about it in the West. That's what's happening. I've been looking for a book. Some of you might know one. Feel free to say so in the show notes, or excuse me, in the comments. You can hit me up on Twitter, or you can write it on YouTube. And by the way, I do want to say this about YouTube comments, and actually about this show. There's been a lot of complaints by people, about ads. We control very little of that. YouTube, one of the ways, the devious ways that they suppress a show is by front loading it with commercials to try to deter you from watching it. And it gives them a kind of deniability. Well, we're not suppressing you. Sometimes it takes the form of, pinwheeling. You try to load the show and it just pinwheels. It takes a while, for it to upload. Again, you just claim, tech issues. So there's that. So I hope that you'll stay the course, and I hope you'll like, share, and, support a show like this. I feel like what we're doing is important. But some of you come into the comments without, you're making comments or asking questions about things that are addressed in the episode. I don't respond to those, or I do so rarely, because before you comment, watch an entire episode. The people who need to hear this did not make it to this point in this episode. But just so you understand, I take much more seriously comments from people that have shown the respect of actually listening to the argument, to the show, before actually, commenting on it. Some people are just trolls and probably bots, and therefore they just get deleted. YouTube has a way of doing that I don't fully understand. And sometimes comments that are not posted are withheld for reasons I don't understand. They seem like totally innocuous kind of comments that YouTube, for some reason, shadow bans. But that's a reality. But I have been thinking of a book that I want to recommend to you that I think is the best book to describe what Islam actually looks like. And I've had a hard time finding one, because almost all of them are quite academic, or they're coming from a secular mindset, and therefore they're maybe talking about the issues, but because the author themselves does not understand religion of any kind, they fail to understand the actual driver in Islam. So they don't actually comment on any of that. So I've been trying to, and as I say, so much of this is suppressed. I ended up finding a little book, and it may have been, I think it was recommended to me on Amazon, where I was looking up books on another subject. And then, sometimes it'll say people who read this also read this. And it's a book called Ravished Armenia. Ravished Armenia. It's sometimes titled An Auction of Souls. This little book is 95 pages. It's very short. You'll read it in a day. It will definitely hold your attention, but I do want to warn you, it's rough. But any book that's going to tell the truth is going to be. Now, this is talking about the Armenian genocide, but it's one girl's story, a Christian girl's story, and she holds no punches about Islam, about what happened. And she's very clear that the driver of the violence and the human trafficking was always Islam. It wasn't because the people were Turks. It wasn't because they were military enemies. It was because they were Muslims. And this is what their religion told them they could do to men and women: kill all the men and save the girls for themselves. I highly recommend this book. It's like $7, $7.99 on Amazon. It's very cheap. Here it is. It's very cheap, very inexpensive little paperback. As you can see, it's very, very, thin little book. As I say, about 95 pages. I encourage you to read this book. I just bought 15 copies. I'm going to share it with a lot of other people because it's the best book that I've come across yet to explain how Islam actually operates. And while she's talking about what was taking place in Asia Minor, in Turkey, and in Armenia, this is what it looks like in Africa today. This book was published in 1916. but it's still relevant. This is still what it looks like today. It's just, there's just some modest modernizing of how it happens. But the reason she wrote this story was very similar to me talking about this today. She wrote it because people in the West were not being told the reality of what was happening. It was largely a hidden story. The same took place with the Holocaust. It wasn't until after the war that people truly understood the scale of the horror. But prior to that, it was mostly ignored. They knew that Jews were being rounded up. They knew they were being put on boxcars. They knew they were being driven out. They knew that many of them were seeking refuge and asylum. But the scale of what was happening had been missed. Such was the case with this, and it was driven by Islam. It's driven by Islam. Now, I'm sure because I've said all these things about that faith that this episode is going to be choked like crazy, because you can't tell the truth on this platform. You just can't. And so it won't get recommended and hardly be shared. But this story is so incredibly important. It is so incredibly important. I want you to pray for our Christian brethren in Africa, particularly in Nigeria. I want you to pray for them. And I wish I could say to you today that I know of a great organization for you to contribute to. I'm sure there are several. I don't know of one right offhand that I can just point you to. And I'm not sure I want to point you to just one because there are several. And I'll leave that to you to make your determination about where you give those funds. But I encourage you to do it, to help these poor people and to bring attention to this by talking about it just in your own circle, educating people of what's happened by sharing this podcast. I also want to applaud President Trump. I keep talking about shining that laser in hopes that someone in power, someone with resources can bring real artillery to bear. You know, what I am on this show, what I am with my work by putting boots on the ground is I am like the advanced scout who goes over the hill, who rides off into the horizon and then comes back with my horse all lathered up and an arrow through my hat. And I say, let me tell you what's going on over there, so that the real army can bring real firepower to bear. That's what we're trying to do on this show. That's what we're trying to do. And there's no greater firepower than the President of the United States. And the President of the United States a few days ago tweeted this: if the Nigerian government continues to allow the killing of Christians, the USA will immediately stop all aid and assistance to Nigeria and may very well go in there into that now disgraced country, guns a-blazing. That's the way he put it. Guns a-blazing, to completely wipe out the Islamic terrorists who are committing these horrible atrocities. I'm hereby instructing our Department of War to prepare for possible action. If we attack, it will be fast, vicious, and sweet, just like the terrorist thugs attack on our cherished Christians. Warning, the Nigerian government better move fast. I love that. I love that. I'm so grateful, President Trump. If by some chance you happen to see this the way you happen to see me on Bannon's show, thank you so much. Thank you so much, not just for this tweet, but I hope that if necessary, this is what you will do. And I would want to say to you, Mr. President, trust nothing the Nigerian government tells you, because they're lying. They're going to tell you that this isn't happening, that it's being exaggerated, that it's global warming or some other nonsense. It absolutely isn't. It is a genocide. Trust nothing they say to you. They're lying. Second thing, we've got to get out of the United Nations. Indeed, we have to destroy the United Nations. What a corrupt organization. They're using our money to persecute Christians. And thirdly, Saudi Arabia is not our friend. This has been another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.